I didn't know my life was about to split in two the moment I stepped into St. Michael's Cathedral. One half ended there, among marble floors, echoing prayers, and people who had never loved my father-in-law, but were very much in love with his money. The other half hadn't begun yet. It was waiting patiently, watching, learning. Richard Turner was dead. 6 months of brutal cancer had finally taken him, and the man who built Turner Enterprises into a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing empire was now reduced to a polished wooden coffin beneath stained glass saints who had never worked a day in their lives. I stood near the back, hands folded, face carefully neutral, pretending to mourn like everyone else. But the truth was uglier. The entire funeral felt like a corporate-sponsored Greek tragedy. Performative grief, expensive sorrow, strategic tears. My husband, Daniel Turner, stood at the front in a tailored black suit that looked more red carpet than funeral. He dabbed his eyes with a handkerchief that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Every movement was precise, every expression rehearsed. The board members watched him like vultures circling fresh meat. I could almost see the dollar signs floating behind their eyes. To them, I was nothing, just the useless daughter-in-law who married into money, the woman with no real job, the one who sometimes showed up to the office and played on her computer. I had heard that exact phrase at least a dozen times over the past 3 years, usually whispered by men who couldn't balance their own checkbooks without assistance. But Richard had been different. He had been my mentor, my ally, the only one in that room who had ever taken me seriously. We had spent countless late nights in his study, laughing quietly over expensive scotch while he dismantled the board's incompetence with surgical precision. He taught me the real business, not the sanitized MBA nonsense, but the kind that involved factory floors, exhausted managers, and knowing every employee's name. The funeral was packed with people who had never respected Richard's vision, only his wealth. As I stood there, listening to hollow condolences and watching power quietly shift hands, one thought repeated itself in my mind like a slow, steady drumbeat. They have no idea what's coming. I straightened my shoulders, inhaled deeply, and whispered so softly only I could hear it. Rest easy, Richard. This circus is about to get very interesting. Before the funeral, before the boardroom, before anyone decided I was disposable, I was already learning how to disappear. My name is Rena Ward. And yes, I know how ironic that sounds, now that I'm telling this story as a woman who was never supposed to matter. I was 34 when I married Daniel Turner. I wasn't born into money. I wasn't raised in rooms with oil paintings and legacy furniture. I grew up in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood where stability meant paying bills on time, and ambition meant working harder than the person next to you. I studied systems engineering. Not because it sounded impressive at cocktail parties, but because I liked understanding how things actually worked, how small decisions echoed through large structures, how inefficiencies hid in plain sight, how people made the same mistakes over and over because nobody slowed down long enough to look. Daniel and I met at a fundraiser Richard hosted for a technical college partnership. Daniel was charming in the effortless way men learn when they grow up knowing doors will open for them. He was handsome, confident, and very aware of how he was perceived. I was quieter. I asked Richard questions no one else did, about production bottlenecks, about labor turnover, about why one plant outperformed another with identical equipment. Richard noticed. Daniel didn't. At first. Our relationship unfolded fast, fueled by dinners, travel, and the intoxicating gravity of the Turner name. When Daniel proposed, he did it properly. Private, expensive ring, carefully curated moment. I said yes, believing love and ambition could coexist. Marriage, however, introduced me to my real role. I became adjacent to power. Adjacent to wealth, adjacent to relevance. At Turner Enterprises, I was never officially assigned a meaningful position. Consultant was the word they used, vague enough to sound respectable, empty enough to mean nothing. I let them believe that. Because while they were busy underestimating me, Richard was teaching me everything. He invited me into his study late at night, when the noise of appearances faded. We talked factories, not headlines, people, not stock prices. He showed me internal reports that never reached the board, explained which executives were competent and which were parasites. "You listen," he told me once, pouring us whiskey with a steady hand. "That already puts you ahead of half the men in this building." The board never noticed those nights. They saw me as Daniel's quiet wife, the one who didn't compete, the one who didn't threaten. And Daniel loved the image of me, loved that I didn't outshine him, loved that I made his ambition look effortless by comparison. What I didn't realize back then, what I couldn't admit to myself, was that love built on optics eventually collapses under reality. And the first cracks had already formed. I just hadn't learned how to see them yet. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere. They just never arrived loudly enough to demand attention. At first, it was small things, harmless, almost forgettable. Daniel would interrupt me mid-sentence at dinners with board members, gently redirecting the conversation as if he were helping me stay on track. "You don't want to bore them," he'd say later, with a smile that was supposed to be affectionate. When I started spending more time at the office, unofficially of course, people reacted with polite confusion. "Oh, are you working on something?" someone from HR once asked, her tone hovering between curiosity and condescension. Daniel laughed it off. "They're just curious," he said. "You know how corporate culture is." But the culture was clear. I was tolerated, not respected. Board members began excluding me from conversations that once included me when Richard was present. Meetings were rescheduled without notice. Documents I had previously reviewed stopped appearing in my inbox. When I asked questions, I was met with tight smiles. "Richard handled that," David Sterling once said dismissively. "As you know, we're moving in a new direction now. A new direction that did not include me." Even family gatherings shifted. Daniel's mother, always polite, never warm, began asking pointed questions about my plans. "You don't want to rely on Daniel forever," she said over dessert one evening, her spoon tapping porcelain like punctuation. "Men need to feel useful." I wanted to ask what that made me, but I didn't. Instead, I told myself it was grief, stress, transition, that Richard's illness had thrown everyone off balance. I told myself Daniel was overwhelmed, that the pressure of legacy weighed heavily on him, that his impatience wasn't cruelty, it was fear. Still, the atmosphere changed. Whispers followed me through hallways. Laughter softened when I approached. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. One night, I overheard Kyle Harrison joking near the elevators. "She doesn't even have a real position," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Once Richard's gone, she'll fade out. Just watch." No one contradicted him. When I told Daniel, he shrugged. "Kyle's an idiot," he said. "Why do you care what he thinks?" "Because idiots don't speak with confidence unless they believe someone will protect them." And slowly, subtly, I realized something unsettling. They weren't afraid of me. They were waiting for me to disappear. I felt it in the way Daniel stopped asking my opinion, in how decisions were made without discussion, in how my presence became optional. I was still inside the room, but no longer part of it. And beneath all my rationalizations, one quiet thought refused to go away. Richard knew this was coming. That thought sat heavy in my chest. Because if he knew, then the story wasn't about loss. It was about preparation. 3 weeks before Richard died, he asked me to come to his study. Not Daniel, not the board, me. The house was unnaturally quiet that afternoon, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Richard sat in his leather chair by the window, thinner than I had ever seen him, his skin drawn tight over sharp bones. Chemotherapy had taken its toll, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "I'm dying," he said casually, as if commenting on the weather. I froze. The words landed heavily, knocking the breath out of me. I opened my mouth to protest, to deny it, to say something comforting, but he raised a hand. "Doctors give me a month, maybe 2, he continued. and I'll be damned if I let parasites tear apart everything I built. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey with a steady hand, then slid a thick folder across the desk toward me. Open it. Inside were share transfer documents. I stared at the numbers, my brain struggling to catch up. 71%. Controlling interest. Turner Enterprises. I want you to have it, he said simply. The room spun. Richard, I can't. Daniel. Daniel understands optics, Richard interrupted calmly. You understand operations. My daughter knows how to look like a CEO. You know how to be one. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. But they won't accept me, I whispered. Richard smiled, a tired, knowing smile. That's why it has to be you. We signed the papers that day, quietly. His attorney, my lawyer, Sarah Rodriguez, a notary named Barbara who had no idea she was witnessing corporate nuclear war. Before I left, Richard looked at me and said something that still echoes in my head. Don't tell Daniel. He'll turn it into a social media caption. We both laughed. But beneath the humor was certainty. He had planned this. And as I walked out of that study, clutching a secret powerful enough to burn the company down, I realized something chilling. The people who underestimated me were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. After Richard died, I didn't cry the way people expected me to. Not loudly, not publicly, not performatively. Grief settled into me like a weight behind my ribs, heavy, constant, private. I moved through the days with deliberate calm, observing everything, listening more than I spoke, letting people reveal themselves in the absence of the one man who had kept them in check. Daniel threw himself into appearances. He wore black, perfectly tailored suits, gave speeches filled with phrases like legacy, continuity, vision. People nodded along, mistaking confidence for competence. I stood beside him when necessary, silent, supportive, invisible. Inside, I was cataloging everything. Who avoided my eyes, who suddenly smiled too much, who spoke as if decisions were already made. When Daniel announced, without consulting me, that he would be taking over Richard's office, something inside me tightened. He didn't ask. He assumed. That night, I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling while his breathing evened out into sleep. My mind replayed Richard's voice. Don't let them tear it apart. I wondered if I had misunderstood him, if I had imagined the weight of that responsibility. But the next morning erased all doubt. Daniel hosted a celebration, not a memorial, not a strategy meeting, a party. Ice sculptures of the company logo, champagne fountains, a string quartet nobody listened to, board members laughing too loudly, congratulating each other on a new era. I watched Kyle Harrison pat Daniel on the back like he'd already won something. I watched David Sterling rewrite history in real time, praising Daniel's leadership after years of quietly undermining Richard. No one acknowledged me. When Kyle approached and made his joke about me going from CEO's wife to whatever it is you do here, I smiled. Not because it was funny, because I understood something then. They were testing boundaries, seeing how much they could take before I reacted. I didn't react. I let them think I was humiliated. Let them believe I was fragile. Let them assume silence meant surrender. That was my mistake once. It wouldn't be again. Because if grief had taught me anything, it was this. I didn't need to raise my voice. I needed to wait. Friday morning arrived like a freight train nobody had ordered. At 9:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with an email from David Sterling's assistant. Polite, sterile, ominous. Your presence is requested in Conference Room A. Conference Room A was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A table so long it could land aircraft. Chairs that made you feel small the moment you sat down. 6 board members were already there when I walked in. David at the head, naturally. Kyle to his right, smiling like he'd practiced it in the mirror. Tom Williams blinking awake in the 3rd chair. 3 others whose names I could never remember. Men who existed entirely to vote when told. I took my seat without a word. David folded his hands theatrically. "Thank you for joining us," he began. "Given recent leadership changes, we've been reviewing our organizational structure." I nodded, attentive, cooperative. Corporate language flowed freely. Alignment, efficiency, strategic objectives. Kyle couldn't contain himself. "What David means," he cut in, grinning, "is that we've decided to terminate your position, effective immediately." The room went quiet. I waited for the expected reaction to rise: shock, fear, humiliation. It didn't. "Just like that?" I asked, genuinely curious. David's lips tightened. "You'll receive 2 months severance and a positive reference." I smiled. That wasn't in the script. "Perfect," I said, standing. "I was worried you'd make this awkward." Kyle's smile faltered. "I appreciate the efficiency," I continued. "Clean breaks are healthier." They had expected pleading, tears, maybe anger. Instead, I thanked them and walked out. Back home, I opened the safe hidden behind a terrible abstract painting Daniel had bought because it felt bold. Inside lay the document that made everything else irrelevant. The share transfer agreement. 71%. I texted my attorney, Sarah Rodriguez. "They fired me. How's our position?" Her reply came 30 seconds later. "Legally ironclad. Sit tight. Let them dig." And dig they did. Rumors spread by Monday. I was unstable. I was bitter. I was having an affair with someone from HR. Daniel called once. "People are talking," he said. "You're making me look bad." I almost laughed. While they were busy burying me with whispers, Sarah updated me on something far more interesting. The board was planning to sell 2 profitable subsidiaries. Short-term gain, long-term destruction. It was reckless, greedy, predictable, and it confirmed what Richard had always known. They weren't leaders, they were looters. Sunday night was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, not peaceful, not restful, empty. Daniel hadn't come home. He hadn't texted. I didn't ask where he was. For the first time since we'd met, his absence felt final. Not temporary, not circumstantial, but symbolic. I sat alone in the living room with the lights off, the city glowing faintly through the windows. The silence pressed against my chest, and for the first time since Richard's death, I let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. Not anger, grief. I missed Richard in a way that surprised me, not just as a mentor, but as the only person in that world who had ever seen me clearly, who had trusted me without spectacle, who hadn't confused confidence with noise. I replayed his last weeks in my mind, the calm in his voice, the certainty in his eyes, the weight of the folder sliding across his desk. This is yours now. What if I failed him? That was the thought that finally broke me. Not losing Daniel, not being fired, not being erased by people who never mattered. Failing Richard. I poured a glass of water I didn't drink, sat on the edge of the couch with my hands clasped, staring at nothing, wondering if I had misjudged my own strength. I was alone. Truly alone. No allies in the house. No support from the board. A husband who saw me as a liability. And for the first time, the fear crept in. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet and corrosive. What if they destroyed the company before I could stop them? What if the court sided with them? What if all I had was a piece of paper and no power to enforce it? I stood and walked into Richard's old office. Daniel had already claimed it, but it still smelled faintly of leather and cedar. I stood by the window and rested my forehead against the glass. "I don't know if I can do this," I whispered into the dark. There was no answer. But as I stood there, something shifted. Fear didn't disappear. It hardened. I realized something simple and terrifying. They thought I was broken. They thought firing me had ended the story. They thought silence meant weakness. And if that was the role they had cast me in, then I would let them believe it. Just a little longer. Monday morning, I put on my navy suit. The one Daniel once joked made me look like a well-paid accountant. At the time, I'd taken it as an insult. Now I understood how perfect it was. Accountants were underestimated, ignored, trusted just enough to handle things no one else wanted to look at. They were also the people who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. I paired it with a white shirt, a burgundy tie Richard had given me 2 Christmases ago, and the cufflinks that had belonged to his father. I wanted him with me, in spirit, in intention, when I walked back into that building. Security stopped me at the entrance. "You'll need an escort," the guard said, his voice firm, unfamiliar. They sent Janet from HR. She looked deeply uncomfortable, clutching her tablet like a shield as we rode the elevator in silence. The doors felt slower than usual. Each floor that passed tightened something in my chest. "This is highly irregular," she said finally. "I know," I replied gently, "and I appreciate you doing your job." She glanced at me. "Are you about to do something extreme?" I smiled faintly. Define extreme. The elevator opened onto the executive floor. When I walked into the boardroom, the reaction was immediate. Kyle nearly choked on his coffee. David's face cycled through confusion, then recognition, then dread. Tom startled awake like he'd sensed danger. "Good morning," I said cheerfully, setting my briefcase on the table. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" David stood. "You don't work here anymore." "True," I said, pulling out a chair and sitting calmly at the head of the table. "You fired me on Friday." I opened my briefcase and placed the folder squarely in the center. "But I still own this place." Silence fell like a dropped glass. Kyle grabbed the documents first. His hand shook as he flipped through the pages, his expression collapsing in slow motion. Confidence to confusion to pure horror. "This isn't real," he whispered. "It's notarized," I said. "Filed, reviewed, and legally binding." David found his voice, strained and tight. "This could destabilize the company." I leaned back, folding my hands. "No, you already did that." My phone buzzed on the table. I looked down and smiled. Perfect timing. I answered and put it on speaker. "This is Victoria Chen," the voice said. "I need to meet with the majority shareholder today." David went pale. 2:00 works, I said calmly. "I'll bring my attorney and my CFO." I glanced at Margaret, who looked like someone had just dropped her into another universe. The call ended, and in that moment, I felt it, the shift. Fear left the room. It settled squarely on the people who deserved it. By Tuesday morning, the boardroom felt like a waiting room for consequences. They sat differently now, shoulders hunched, eyes avoiding mine, confidence drained out of them like air from a punctured tire. 4 days earlier, these same men had fired me without hesitation. Now they looked like employees waiting to be called into HR. The court hearing was short, brutally efficient. David's attorney argued that Richard had been mentally compromised, that the share transfer was suspicious, that no sane man would hand 71% of a multi-billion-dollar company to his daughter-in-law. Sarah dismantled them piece by piece. Medical clearance, witness testimony, notarized documents. And finally, the Sudoku. Judge Morrison didn't even hide her impatience. "Unless you have actual evidence of coercion," she said flatly, "this transfer stands." The gavel fell. Just like that, the last illusion they were clinging to shattered. By 11 a.m., I reconvened the board. Same room, same table, different power. I took Richard's old seat at the head. "Kyle," I said calmly, "your resignation is effective immediately." He opened his mouth, closed it, then stood, grabbed his ridiculous world's best executive mug, and walked out without a word. No argument, no speech, no dignity. David followed soon after, removed by vote, his authority evaporating in real time. 2 others resigned within the hour, suddenly remembering long-planned retirements and personal priorities. Only Margaret stayed, and I kept her. The subsidiary sales were canceled. The audits began. Executive bonuses were frozen. News broke that afternoon. Fired executive revealed as majority owner. Corporate coup from beyond the grave. My phone didn't stop vibrating. And then Daniel called. He didn't scream this time. He begged. "You blindsided me," he said, voice tight. "You embarrassed me. Everyone's talking." I let the silence stretch. "You fired your wife without doing basic due diligence," I said evenly. "That wasn't my doing. You made me look foolish." "No," I replied. "You did that yourself." He didn't apologize. He didn't ask how I was. That told me everything. That evening, I stood alone in Richard's office, city lights stretching endlessly outside the windows. The company was safe. The parasites were gone, and the man who had trusted me hadn't been wrong. The morning after everything settled, I arrived at the office early. No cameras, no reporters, no entourage. Just quiet. Sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, washing over the desk that had once belonged to Richard. I ran my fingers along the polished wood and let myself breathe for the first time in weeks. This wasn't victory in the way movies sell it. There was no rush, no applause, no satisfaction sharp enough to call revenge. What I felt instead was steadiness, the kind that comes when chaos finally exhausts itself. Daniel moved out 2 weeks later. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument, just a calm conversation where we both acknowledged what had been true for a long time. He loved the idea of me, not the woman I actually was. I wished him well and meant it. Turner Enterprises didn't transform overnight. Real rebuilding never does. But the bleeding stopped. The audits revealed what Richard had suspected. Systems were corrected. People who cared stayed. People who didn't quietly disappeared. Margaret proved invaluable, methodical, honest, relentless. Together we focused on factories, workers, and long-term stability instead of optics. No champagne fountains, no CEO aesthetic, just work. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear Richard's voice in my head. Knowing every employee's name matters more than knowing stock prices. He was right. And here's the lesson I learned, the one I hope stays with anyone listening. Being underestimated is painful. Being dismissed hurts. Being invisible can break you if you let it. But invisibility can also be a shield. Silence can be strategy. Patience can be power. You don't have to announce who you are to become who you're meant to be. Sometimes the strongest move is waiting and then standing up when it finally matters. I didn't take anything from them. I simply stopped letting them take from me. And that made all the difference.